Hello and welcome to more history stuff. Firstly, I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas and looking forward to a positive new year. As you can see, I got a brand new gilet for Christmas, which buttoned up gives me a bit of a Bond villain vibe, which I quite like, I quite enjoy. So we're going to go with that for a while. And in this video, I want to talk about the Battle of Wakefield, fought in Yorkshire on this day in 1460, 30th of December. I've got a few notes here just to remind me of the details, so forgive me if I occasionally glance over here and turn the pages. So basically the Battle of Wakefield was one of the turning points in the Civil War in England in the mid to late 15th century that we call the Wars of the Roses. And what happened was that Richard of York, Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, head of the Yorkist faction, he was defeated and killed outside his castle of Sandal near Wakefield in Yorkshire. He and many of his supporters, including his son Edmund, were either killed on the battlefield or caught and put to death afterwards. And a great sort of swathe of the Yorkist leadership was wiped out in a single day. And leadership of the Yorkist faction after this now passed to one of Richard's other sons, Edward, who was this very forceful character who would resurrect the Yorkist cause and very successfully too eventually become Edward IV, defeating the Lancastrians and more or less destroying them really, at least for the foreseeable future. But to rewind to Wakefield, I'll give you a bit of context. What had happened shortly before the battle was that York and his chief supporters had been forced out of England. York had fled to Ireland, but they staged a comeback. I mean, the Wars of the Roses are this constant sort of seesaw of contrasting fortunes. One side is up, then it's down, and then back again. His supporters won a battle at Northampton, which enabled York to come back from exile in Ireland and basically seize control of the government in England again, along with his chief ally, the Earl of Warwick, who I've mentioned before on here, Richard Neville, the Kingmaker. And between them, they seized control of the person of the king, Henry VI, who's technically head of the House of Lancaster, but is really by this point just a figurehead passed about between the rival factions. A very ineffective character, sadly, for him. He had inherited the strain of mental illness, of insanity from his Valois French royal ancestors. And this seems to have crippled him, and whatever sort of capacity he had was undermined by this mental weakness he had. Although he had his moments, Henry, he wasn't entirely ineffective. By this point, 1459, 1460, as I said, he's really just a figurehead, used as a convenient tool or device by the warring factions. The effective head of the Lancastrian faction at this point is Henry's consort, his wife, Margaret of Anjou. And when York and Warwick come back to England and seize control of London and the government, she's in the north in Hull. And York has got the advantage at this point, but what he does is something very controversial, shocking really. He declares that he wants to be king. He actually lays claim to the throne, and he walks up to the throne itself and he physically lays his hand on it as this sort of very sort of blunt act of symbolism, saying that I have a right to the throne, which is a big shock to everyone concerned, all of the sort of nobles and high clergy on either side, even within his own faction, because up until this point the Yorkists have been claiming not to be attacking the king himself, which is a really big deal, because the king is supposed to be appointed by God, he's the divinely anointed monarch, but to be attacking his evil advisors and trying to do the king a favour really, and get him out of the clutches of these wicked advisors and evil counsellors who are surrounding him. But what York does at this point is that he simply clears all that away and he goes for broke and says, no, I should be king. Henry VI is unfit for purpose. He's completely incompetent, and the crown should be put on my head instead. And this, as I said, is a real shock. He seems to have miscalculated. His own supporters, many of them, don't like this at all, and he's forced to sort of, him and Warwick, they have this series of emergency meetings where they sort of try and scramble together a compromise. And what they come out with is this sort of bodged arrangement whereby Henry VI will be allowed to remain on the throne for the remainder of his life, but when he dies, York would inherit the crown. I mean, this is really Warwick's idea, and York himself doesn't really like it, because he's almost 50 by this point. He's 49, and he's a decade older than Henry VI. And there's no guarantee that he will live, that he will outlive Henry. So it's not really it's not really to anyone's advantage. You know, nobody likes this sort of deal that Warwick cooks up. And then news arrives from the north that Margaret and her supporters are gathering momentum. One of her chief supporters is Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, and along with Henry Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, Margaret's other chief commander, they are now attacking Yorkist estates up in Yorkshire and the northern counties, and they're running riots. They're pillaging these estates, absolutely wrecking farms, villages, towns. And basically the whole of the north is going up in flames, and the reason Margaret and her allies are able to suddenly whip up so much support is because everyone is outraged by the news of what York is planning to do, that his sort of blatant attempt to seize the crown. So this is a real miscalculation on York's part, and he then makes another one because he decides to rush north to deal with the Lancastrians. And he moves too quickly, really. What he should have done in hindsight, which is always convenient, was to wait in the south, gather more troops, more reinforcements, particularly those led by his son Edward, and then march north with this sort of combined army to face the Lancastrians on equal terms. Instead, what he does is he sort of goes off with a smaller army, inadequate really. He rushes north, and he finds that as soon as he crosses the River Trent and gets into the Midlands and the northern counties, he finds an absolutely dreadful situation, because not only are the Lancastrians pillaging his estates and basically destroying everything in sight, but the weather, and we're into autumn, winter now, the weather is particularly awful this year. The harvest had failed, many of the roads were flooded and impassable, which meant that York and his men found food hard to come by. They couldn't really find anywhere to lodge, to billet. His supply lines were being cut. So York is really sort of charged into a real mess. And as he rides through Nottinghamshire, his scouts, his advance guard, are attacked near the town of Worksop by the Lancastrians, and they're cut to pieces. So York is really being faced with an absolute barrage of really bad news, and what he needs to do is to find a refuge, somewhere he can hole up for a while, basically sort of get his men inside a nice safe castle, cut his losses, and just wait for his reinforcements to come up and hopefully get him out of this really sort of terrible situation that he's got himself into. And he manages to do that. He manages to get to his manor of Wakefield and his castle of Sandal, which is a very well sort of fortified, impregnable stronghold, exactly what York needs. He gets in there. By this point, the Lancastrians, led by Somerset, are at Pontefract, which is only 10 miles to the east. I think you can tell I'm reading off my notes here. So the Lancastrians are nearby, which is, you know, worrying, and they've got far more men, which is even more worrying, but at least York is secure. He doesn't have to do anything. So long as his food supplies last, he can sit tight inside his castle and wait for help to arrive. So why did he make this fatal decision to leave the safety of the castle charge out and challenge the Lancastrians to battle, to this fatal battle at Wakefield? Well, the chronicles are divided on this point, and historians are inevitably divided as well. There is some sort of evidence, although much of it reads like sort of rumour and hearsay really, that York was lured by false messages spread about by Lancastrian agents, particularly a man named Andrew Trollope, who was another of Margaret's commanders and probably the most capable of them. He was a veteran of the French wars. He had been part of the garrison in Calais, which was the last significant English stronghold in France by this point. And he may well have been the brains behind the Lancastrian cause at this moment in time, because for a short time they do rather well, at least while Trollope is still alive. And it may well be that he sort of cleverly lured York out of his castle by sort of use of false banners, false messages. Or the alternative explanation is that York was simply rash and that he decided to charge out of his castle like a bull at a gate because he had completely lost patience with the whole situation, and he just wanted to get this all done in a single battle, smash the Lancastrians, win a great victory, and then he'd be able to march south, probably kill or imprison Henry VI, and just plonk the crown on his head and say, I am, well, he would have been King Richard III, as opposed to the Richard III who came later. But needless to say, it all goes very badly for him. He ignores the advice of his own commanders, who advise him very sensibly to sit tight within the castle and wait for his son Edward to come up with reinforcements from the Welsh March, from the borderlands. But according to a chronicle, York was itching for combat and would not be counselled. He wasn't going to listen. Which proved to be very stupid, because on the 30th of December he led his men out of the castle down into the fields below, where it soon became clear that they were completely surrounded, because much of the Lancastrian army was concealed in the nearby woods. They were waiting for him. One report says that he was surrounded on every side like a fish in a net, which is quite a good image, because that's exactly what had happened to him. He'd walked into a trap. As I said, whether he was tricked into it or this was simply his own sort of folly, his own hubris, I suppose, is unclear. But the outcome is very, very clear. The Lancastrians attack from all sides. The fight is a completely one-sided affair. About 2,000 Yorkists are slaughtered. And York himself was surrounded with his back to a tree, and he goes down fighting, to be fair to him, although he probably doesn't have much choice, because at this point the wars have become very savage and there was really no talk of ransoms or taking him prisoner. The Lancastrians were determined to just kill him and his chief commanders. And he's pulled down and butchered along with 2,000 of his men. His son Edmund, who tried to escape, was caught at the bridge into Wakefield, and according to a later legend, he was murdered on the spot by Lord Clifford, a Lancastrian nobleman whose own family had suffered very badly in the wars. I think his father and maybe several other relatives had been killed by the Yorkists in previous battles, and so Clifford, as soon as he sees York's son, he grabs him and stabs him to death, which is the subject of several sort of later melodramatic paintings, which may well be true, because by this point the civil war in England had become this cycle of blood feud where the noble families are just slaughtering each other. It had become very savage, very merciless, which civil wars tend to do if they continue. There's something always exceptionally nasty about a civil war. It gets very bloody, and that was certainly the case during the Wars of the Roses. The other Yorkist commander of any note, Salisbury, he was captured, taken alive, led back to Pontefract Castle, where, I quote, "a group of nobles who loved him not hacked off his head." So again, another sort of gangster-style killing. And several other commanders, many captured Yorkist knights, are also killed in this very brutal, merciless way. And the heads of all these men, York and his allies, were stuck on poles and then paraded 30 miles to the city of York, where, in mockery of York's pretensions to be king, his head with a paper crown on it was mounted over the city gates. So that was the end of the ambitions of Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York. Far from the end of the Wars of the Roses, of course. They would rumble on for many years yet, but that was the end of him. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope my account of the battle is reasonably accurate. Incidentally, if you noticed some messages popping up in the corner, I'm sorry about that. That's Facebook. I hope they're not too distracting. Thank you. Okay, I'll see you next time.